He didn't wait for her to stop shaking. Vivian Okafor had been in surgery for 11 hours. The kind of surgery where the nurses stop making eye contact with the family in the waiting room. The kind where the surgeon comes out looking like he aged 10 years between the first incision and the last stitch. She had lost the baby at 22 weeks. A little girl they'd told her husband, though he never asked. And then her body had decided to take that loss and compound it into something that nearly killed her too. A hemorrhage. An emergency hysterectomy. A blood pressure that kept crashing until the attending physician looked at the monitor and quietly said a prayer she couldn't hear. She survived. That part mattered. What happened next was the part that would take years to fully understand. Vivian had barely been moved out of recovery when her husband, Elliot Marsh, appeared in the doorway of her room with a manila envelope under his arm. Not flowers. Not her mother, who'd been calling from Sudbury every hour. Not even a coffee. Just the envelope, held flat against his ribs, like he was trying to keep it from being noticed. She remembered thinking he looked different standing there. The overhead light caught the angles of his face wrong somehow. She'd been with this man for 9 years, married for 6, and in that moment she couldn't place the expression he was wearing. It wasn't grief. It wasn't relief that she was alive. It was something closer to impatience, and that small detail settled somewhere in her chest, like a stone dropped into still water. "You're awake," he said. "Apparently," she said. Her voice came out cracked and thin. The anesthetic had scraped her throat raw. He came to the bedside, but he didn't take her hand. He set the envelope on the blanket near her knee. "Viv." He cleared his throat. "I need you to look at this when you're ready." She looked at the envelope, then at him, then back at the envelope. "What is it?" He didn't answer right away. He walked to the window instead and stood with his back to her, looking out at the Toronto skyline going gray in the late afternoon. February light, the kind that makes everything look like it's been drained of something essential. "Divorce papers," he said. The monitor beside her bed registered the change in her heart rate. A nurse appeared at the door within seconds, glanced at the screen, glanced at Elliot's back, and then very carefully did not react to anything she was seeing. "I'll check back in 5 minutes," the nurse said and left. Vivian didn't speak for a long time. There was nothing wrong with her mind. The anesthetic haze had lifted more than he'd probably counted on. But there was a specific quality to the silence she was sitting inside of that felt important to stay in just a little longer. The kind of silence that tells you something. That makes clear, without a single word being exchanged, that everything you thought you understood about your own life was a rough draft. "I almost died today," she said finally. "I know. We lost our daughter. I know, Viv, and you brought me divorce papers." He turned from the window then. He had the decency, at least, to look uncomfortable. But discomfort isn't the same as remorse, and she already knew the difference. "There's someone else," he said. "I've been trying to tell you for months. You were pregnant and I didn't know how. I was going to wait, but what? I survived." The words came out very quietly. Not angry, not yet. Just precise. "You were hoping you wouldn't have to have this conversation at all?" "That's not what I meant, Elliot." She looked at him with the particular clarity that comes from having just outrun your own death. "Get out of my room." He left the envelope. Her name before she married was Vivian Okafor Clement. She was 38 years old. She had grown up in Mississauga, in a house that her parents had paid off before she finished high school, the daughter of a structural engineer and a property lawyer who had taught her. From the time she could sit at a dinner table and follow conversation, that land is the only thing that doesn't disappear. Her mother, Dr. Adaise Okafor Clement, had said it so many times it had become a kind of family liturgy. Land doesn't depreciate the way people do, Vivienne. Buildings can burn, markets crash, but the ground under the building, that stays. Vivian had gone into commercial real estate at 24 and spent the next 14 years being very, very good at it. She had an instinct for property that her colleagues described, with varying degrees of envy, as almost unfair. She could walk a neighborhood and tell you, within a margin of error that impressed even her own firm, which blocks were going to matter in 5 years. She had been right about the East Harbor development before anyone was talking about it. She had been right about Canary District before the cranes arrived. She had quietly and methodically built a portfolio of commercial and residential properties under a numbered holding company that her husband had never shown much interest in understanding. That had always been his choice, as not hers. She had tried, early in the marriage, to explain the structures. The holding company, the trust her mother had helped her set up in 2017, the way the properties were titled. Elliot's eyes would glaze within the first 2 minutes. He was a partner at a mid-sized architecture firm, and he had his own professional world that absorbed most of his attention. He was not stupid, but he was incurious about her finances, in the way that some men are incurious about the things their wives are good at. Not from malice, exactly, but from a kind of ambient arrogance that assumes it doesn't matter enough to learn. He had signed documents when she asked him to sign documents. He had never read them. This would become relevant. The divorce papers were real. She had her own lawyer, a woman named Priya Sundaralingam, who had been in her life since law school, and who arrived at the hospital the morning after with 2 coffees and the expression of someone who is already 3 steps ahead of the problem. "He's retained counsel," Priya said, settling into the chair beside the bed. "Someone from a Bay Street firm. Specializes in high asset separation." Of course he did. He's claiming equal division of matrimonial assets. Priya said it the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis, plainly, so there's no confusion. His position is that the properties held under the numbered company are joint family property because they were acquired during the marriage. Vivienne turned her coffee cup in her hands. She'd been off the IV since that morning, and the first real coffee of her recovery tasted like a small mercy. He doesn't know about the trust. His lawyer will figure it out eventually. But there's a significant distinction between properties held in the trust, which predate the marriage in terms of their originating equity, and anything acquired afterward. Priya paused. "How much does he actually know about your portfolio?" "He knows I work in real estate." Vivian said it without irony, though it was ironic. "He knows we have a nice house in Rosedale. He has no idea about the commercial holdings. He's never asked." Priya wrote something down. "Then we have a conversation to have," she said, "about what he thinks he's walking into." His name, the other woman's name, was Claudine Rowe. Vivian found out the rest of the details the way people find out these things. Not from a dramatic confrontation, not from a private investigator, but from a mutual acquaintance who felt guilty enough about knowing for 8 months that she eventually called and simply told the truth. Claudine was 29. She worked in Elliot's firm. She had apparently been a fixture at his Wednesday evening work events for the better part of 2 years. Vivian filed this information away with the same methodical calm she brought to everything else. She didn't rage. She didn't call him. She lay in her hospital bed for 5 more days recovering from surgery, and she thought, very carefully, about the next several moves. She had learned this from her mother too. When someone shows you they are willing to be cruel at the worst possible moment, you don't give them the satisfaction of seeing you unravel. You get quiet. You get organized. And then, when they have finished congratulating themselves on how well things are going for them, you open the door. Elliot moved out of the Rosedale house while she was still in hospital. He sent a text. She didn't respond. He texted again a week later, something about logistics and the car and a storage unit, and she read it and put her phone down and watched the snow fall outside her bedroom window for a while before she called Priya back. "I want to understand exactly what he's going to claim," she said. "He's going to claim the Rosedale house, possibly 50% of anything under the numbered company that his lawyer can argue falls under matrimonial property law." What does his lawyer know so far? Based on what I've been able to see from their initial filings, he knows about the house. He knows about one investment condo in Liberty Village that's in your name directly, not the company. He knows Elliot has a pension and some registered accounts. Vivienne was quiet for a moment. "And the rest?" Priya took a breath. "He doesn't know about the rest." The rest was considerable. 14 properties in total. 4 commercial, 10 residential, held across 2 numbered companies, and the family trust her mother had set up. The commercial properties alone included a mixed-use building in Leslieville that she'd purchased in 2019 for just under $3 million and was now worth nearly double. There was a retail plaza in Oakville that generated monthly income quietly and reliably, the way good property always did. There were 2 townhouse developments. in the East End that she'd co-financed with a development partner and which had been sold out before the last unit was framed. And then there was the land her mother had put in trust for her in 2016 before the marriage. 43 acres in the Niagara Escarpment, held in a family trust that predated the marriage entirely, that Elliot had once referred to as your family's cottage property, without ever asking to see the title or understand what it was adjacent to. What it was adjacent to was a proposed infrastructure corridor that the provincial government had been quietly consulting on for the past 3 years. The kind of corridor that made land values move in ways that had nothing to do with the land itself. Vivienne had known about the corridor since 2021. She had told no one except Priya and her mother. She had also in 2022 purchased, through the numbered company, with no connection to her personal name, 4 additional parcels of land adjacent to the trust property. Elliot's lawyer was going to try to make a claim on assets acquired during the marriage. Some of that claim might even have some merit. But the anchor of the portfolio, the thing that held the whole structure together, the land that had been generating interest and appreciation, and which was now sitting at the edge of a provincial infrastructure announcement that hadn't happened yet. That land had never been his. It had been her grandmother's before it was her mother's before it was hers. The ground under the building always stays. The first mediation session took place in late March. Elliot arrived with a lawyer whose name was Garfield Brewster, a man in his early 50s, who had the posture of someone accustomed to being the most prepared person in the room. He had a thick brief in front of him, and he opened it with the particular deliberateness of someone who wants you to notice the thickness. Elliot sat beside him looking, Vivienne thought, like a man who had recently convinced himself that he was the wronged party. She had seen this transformation in other people's separations. The way someone who has done a genuinely harmful thing will, given enough time and a sympathetic ear, reframe the whole story until they are the one who suffered. He had the look of someone in the middle of that reframing. It was almost interesting to watch. Claudine was not present, of course. She never was in these settings. The other person is always somewhere else during the negotiation, waiting to be the reward. Priya opened for Vivienne's side with a simple declaration of what was, and was not subject to division. The Rosedale house, yes, that was matrimonial property. Elliot's pension and registered accounts, yes, to be divided appropriately. The Liberty Village condo, potentially, depending on how the purchase equity was traced. Garfield Brewster smiled when she finished, the smile of a man who thinks he knows something. Miss Sundaralingam, he said, we're aware that your client holds additional real property assets which haven't been declared in these proceedings. We'd like to address those now. Of course, Priya said pleasantly. Specifically, the commercial holdings, the numbered company. He slid a document across the table. We've done some due diligence. Priya looked at the document without touching it. Then she looked at Vivienne, who gave the smallest nod. What happened over the next 40 minutes was something that Vivienne would later describe to her mother as a controlled demolition. Priya walked Garfield Brewster, point by point, through the corporate structure, through the dates of incorporation, through the trust instrument that had been in place since before the marriage, through the originating equity for each commercial property, equity that traced back in every case, to funds that predated the marriage or had been gifted through the family trust. Garfield Brewster's smile changed shape twice during this explanation. By the end of it, it was no longer a smile at all. The numbered company assets, Priya said, were financed through capital that originated in a family trust established in 2016. Before the marriage, the corporate structure was in place. Your client was invited, multiple times, to review and understand this structure. He declined. Elliot was looking at the table. Furthermore, Priya continued, sliding her own document across, the Niagara Escarpment land holdings, which your initial filings have not referenced, and which we suspect you may have been unaware of, are held entirely within the 2016 trust. They are not matrimonial property. They never were. Garfield Brewster looked at the document. He looked at it for a long time. Then he leaned over and said something quietly to Elliot that Vivienne couldn't hear. Elliot looked up. For the first time that afternoon, he looked directly at her, not with anger, with something she identified after a moment as the particular disorientation of a person discovering the floor was somewhere other than where they thought. How much, he started. The Niagara land alone, Priya said quietly, is currently assessed at approximately 4.3 million. That assessment predates recent provincial announcements. She paused. There may be additional developments relevant to that valuation. That is not something we're prepared to discuss in this forum. Garfield Brewster excused himself from the room. Elliot didn't follow him. He sat at the table and said nothing. Vivian waited. She had learned to be good at waiting. It was part of the same skill set that made her good at reading property, the ability to sit with something incomplete and not rush it toward resolution before the right moment. Some people find uncertainty unbearable. She had always found it clarifying. What she hadn't expected was the second call, not from Elliot's lawyer. From Elliot himself 3 days after the mediation at 7 in the evening when she was eating leftover soup in her kitchen and listening to the radio. "I didn't know," he said when she picked up. She waited. "About the land. About any of it. I genuinely..." He stopped. "I thought I understood what we had. Financially. I tried to explain it to you several times," she said. "Not unkind. Just factual." He was quiet for a moment. "Was there? Did you?" Another pause. "Was it always like this? You having all of this that I didn't know about?" "You didn't want to know," she said. "There's a difference." She heard him breathing on the other end of the line. "I made a terrible mistake," he said. "More than one? Yes, Viv." "Elliot." She set down her spoon. "I'm not angry at you anymore. I want you to understand that. I was for a while, but I'm not anymore. What I am is very, very clear about what comes next." She looked out the window at the backyard, at the maple tree she'd planted the first spring in the Rosedale house, already starting to bud out despite the cold. "You took something from me that you can't give back. You took it at the worst possible moment. And you did it because you thought you knew the shape of my life. You thought you understood what you were walking away from." She let that settle. "You didn't," she said. The divorce was finalized in October. The settlement was what Priya had projected. The Rosedale house was sold and the proceeds split. Elliot's pension was divided appropriately. The Liberty Village condo was retained by Vivian in exchange for a cash payment that represented its estimated appreciation during the marriage. The commercial portfolio and all trust assets remained entirely hers. Garfield Brewster had fought on the numbered company properties for another 2 months before the documentation made further argument untenable. On the morning the papers were signed, Vivienne drove out to the escarpment property alone. She parked on the gravel pull-off where her mother used to park the old Volvo when they came out here in summers, when Vivienne was small and the land was just land. Fields and old-growth maple, and a view of the lake that went all the way to the horizon on a clear day. She walked the fence line the way she had walked it a dozen times since her grandmother first brought her here and explained, in the particular way of women who have learned everything the hard way, that you hold on to what is yours and you hold on to it quietly, and you never let anyone convince you it doesn't matter. The provincial corridor announcement had come in August. The 4 parcels she'd acquired through the numbered company were now in a rezoning corridor. She'd had 3 calls from developers before she'd even finished reading the news release. She stood at the fence line and looked out over the fields and thought about her daughter, the one who had never arrived, the one whose absence had changed the shape of the year in ways she was still learning to carry. She thought about the hospital room and the envelope on the blanket, and Elliot standing at the window with his back to her. She thought about the particular silence she had sat inside of. In those first moments, the silence that told her something true. She had almost died in February. She had lost the thing she wanted most. And then, in the wreckage of all of that, someone who had promised to love her had walked into the room with paperwork instead of presents. She hadn't unraveled. Her grandmother's land was worth more now than it had ever been. The ground under everything had held. She put her hand on the cedar rail of the fence post, rough and cold and solid in the way that old wood gets, and she stayed there for a long time, looking at the horizon until the light changed and it was time to go.